Hi guys, thanks for coming. As James said, my name is Audrey. I work at a studio that's just up the road in Belltown called Against Gravity. If you have a Vive or an Oculus, you've probably heard of our game Rec Room. If you do not have a Vive or Oculus, you've definitely never heard of it. We are a social app with a lot of little mini games. Wii Sports VR is initially how we sort of paraphrased it. Now it's a little more user-created stuff and just kind of all over the place. We move very fast. We release every 2 weeks. It's a lot of fun. Learn a lot. Gotta stay quick on your feet. But I worked with Vic and Misty back at Gas Powered a million years ago, when it still existed. And I've been in the industry for about 12 years now. I've been part of hiring quite a few people. I apologize in advance to the programmers in the room. My talk is mostly aimed at artists. I have been in a lot of interviews for devs. So I'm going to talk for about 10 or 15 minutes and then take questions. So feel free to ask any programming-oriented questions. I'll answer as well as I can. I have not been involved in the technical side of that a lot, but I have been in a lot of those interviews. So I'm mostly going to talk about portfolios, especially for artists. That is the first thing a hiring manager will see. That is your first impression. And it's probably the most important tool you have for getting a job. It's hard to know what makes a good one, so above all else, let me say that your portfolio will lead directly to the job you get. So it's in your best interest to make sure it reflects the job you want to get. Something I've heard a lot, and I've generally found it to be true, is that...
Be a little closer to that mic.
Oh, there we go, sorry. Money follows passion, not the other way around. If you fill your portfolio with exactly what you want to do, eventually you will find the right job. It may take a job or two. You know, you may have to work your way there, but just keep your eye on what you want to do and fill your portfolio with exactly that, and it will happen. But like I said, the portfolio is the first thing for artists, probably not for devs, the first thing that'll be seen. If they see something they like, then they'll look at your resume, then they'll dig a little deeper. But a fantastic portfolio with a weak resume is a lot more likely to get you a job than the other way around. But hiring is hard. There are a lot of portfolios that come in, dozens for every spot at least. So you're trying to make a good first impression. And it's important to remember in this whole process that a portfolio, an interview, all of this is more about fit than it is about objective quality. If you submitted something to my studio, we would be looking for something that is very different from the industry standard. We're looking for low poly, hand painted, just a step above mobile fidelity work, which is not what my portfolio was mostly full of when I applied for that job. So I guess I'm undermining my own message here, really. But yeah, so you're trying to make sure that the hiring manager sees what is relevant to them. Your first goal is to reduce friction. You want to, when they look at those 100 resumes they have, the first pass will be like, don't see anything, no. Yeah, I'll look closer at this one later. And you want to get, into the good pile there. So, back up a step to a basic that is probably not something I need to say, but what needed to be told to me when I was a student. Have a digital portfolio. When I was at DigiPen a million years ago, they had us print everything out and put it into this binder in little plastic sleeves. And I showed up in my first interview and people kind of gave me a weird look because I had this hard media portfolio. Yeah, it's all digital now. In a pinch, especially as a coder probably, a zip file or a PDF or some sort of downloaded thing can get by. But nine times out of 10, you want a website that you can just pull up in the interview. If you can manage it, that website should look good on mobile. A lot of people look at this stuff on their phone, and anything that leads to your images not loading right or difficulty viewing your stuff is more likely to get you overlooked, like not out of malice, just there's a lot of stuff to go through. Let's see, where am I at? So I get a lot of ArtStation galleries, DeviantArt galleries, stuff like that. And in a pinch, that'll work. But you will get mixed reviews on that. I'm a lot more forgiving of it than all the people I asked when I was like, hey, review my notes for this talk. What do you think about this? I got a lot of people who are like, oh no, I hate art station galleries. I think it's the ads, I don't know, I'm fine with them. But if you can, I recommend putting together a real portfolio site with your resume right there next to it. I use Squarespace for mine. There's a lot of sites like that that help you put together something very easily. One of the advantages of this is that it's very easy to copy a gallery and move it around a little bit. A lot of people will link to their Instagram or their ArtStation or whatever from their portfolio site, and that's great. If somebody is interested in you, they'll look at your portfolio, then they'll look at your resume, and then they'll go dig further, and at that point they're expecting to see rough work. So it's a glimpse beyond the carefully curated stuff you put in your portfolio. Let's see. I have gotten Flash portfolio sites in 2018. It does still exist somehow. But if it prevents you from like right-click direct linking to an image, it can work against you. Anything that makes your portfolio hard to navigate can be a downside. It can also look cool, but just be careful about really bad UX. My first website was a disaster. Let's see. So, a lot of people ask me if it's better to have breadth or depth in your portfolio. And the answer, kind of a softball answer, but it really, really depends on the job. My personal rule of thumb is that the bigger the studio, the more specialized they'll want you to be. That isn't always the case, but it has been in my experience. I am a generalist who works at a very small studio, and with the exact same portfolio that got me my current job, I applied to a larger studio and was told, maybe you want to be a material, like an environmental texture artist. Very, very specific. But my portfolio is mostly environment art. But that wasn't specific enough at a big studio, whereas it was a little too specific for my current studio, and I had to bring in extra work in the interview. So it really depends on what you're going for. But there isn't really a right answer. There's a lot of different kinds of portfolio. They don't have to be fancy. I have a few examples that I'll pull up at the end of some friends of mine. But it is absolutely an accepted practice to have different portfolios for different jobs. One of the advantages of Squarespace, like I said, or any other put it together yourself sort of site where if you don't know how to code, you can still do it. It's easy to copy a page and move stuff around. You don't have to hide your other work. You're just trying to prioritize what you think they're going to want to see for this job. Like, I think this stuff is relevant. Let me move it to the top of the page. And it's a good thing to do that. Not only does it make sure they'll see what you want them to see, but it shows that you've done the research to know what that might be. It's always a good idea to look at a company's stuff. They do a lot of stylized stuff. Okay, I'm going to find everything I have that matches and stick that at the top of this page. Nobody will think that's deceptive or anything. Like, everybody does that. It's cool. But it's, it can be integral. If you're applying to an environment art job and you're billing yourself as an environment artist, you want to make sure your environment art gets seen. If you're applying to a job that you think they're going to care about lighting design, and you only have one thing in your portfolio that touches on lighting design, like move that to the very top. Make sure they see it. Organizing your portfolio is pretty important in general, and it gets more important the more work you have. And always keep pruning the weakest stuff. That is probably the thing I consider the most carefully when I'm making my own portfolio, is that it is only as strong as the weakest thing in it. If you have 10 pieces and they're all pretty good, people will look at that and think, hey, this person's pretty good. But if you have 11 and one of them is bad, they're going to think, oh, well, these 10 good things are the only good things they've done. Ask your friend. Everybody's got that one friend who's, a little too blunt. Like, ask them what to cut. I have like a circle of people that I always ask, what's the weakest thing here? And then it doesn't matter how much you love it, you take it out. The pieces you pick should probably show something useful about your skills, something you can talk about. It's better to have two very different shots, even if they're weaker overall, than it is to have two really similar things. That might not be true. That's what I err towards because I'm a generalist. But you want to know what it says about you. and this is true, not just for artists, like, you wanna pick pieces that show the valuable contributions you made, and you wanna be able to elaborate on those valuable contributions when you're asked. I've been in interviews where people picked out the last thing I expected, and asked me what I learned doing that. And it's great to be able to talk about it. Talk about it on your website too. It's good to have a little text blurb with every image or collection of images saying what your contributions were. Why does it matter? If you're the sole contributor, tell me what software it was used in. Tell me why you made the important decisions you made. If it was a larger project, tell me which parts were your contributions and which parts were not. You can be brief about it, talk more about it during the interview, but it's important to contextualize the pieces some. And by and large, the more technical the job you're applying for, the more valuable that stuff is. Similarly, wireframes, texture sheets, any kind of technical shots of the actual work, absolutely put those in all you can. Like, that stuff is very valuable to see. Sometimes you won't look at stuff without it. Like, definitely include that in, whether it's a normal bake or a hand-painted texture, whatever, just have that stuff in there. Let's see. Once you have a larger body of work, or probably for the devs straight out of the gate, it can be very useful to organize this stuff by project. And I mention this because this was advice given to me the very last time I put my portfolio together, and like, wow, it made a huge difference. It just, like, you can write one blurb about, this is the considerations of the project, these are the technical limitations, and then you can get a little more specific on each image, and it just looks really nice and professional. And like, it was such a, I don't know how it had never occurred to me in 10 years, but somebody suggested that, and like, wow, it made a difference. Okay, so this one I am really bad at, trying to collect new work as you go along. It's crazy stressful when you get laid off and you have 2 hours to scramble to try to find all your files before you have to leave the building. And I've been there twice. You can get through it, but boy, it's a lot easier if you've been taking nice screenshots as you go along. It is not a red flag. Everybody does this. Everybody knows that portfolio upkeep is an important part of being a professional in the industry. Nobody's going to see you doing this and think you're secretly looking for another job. So don't worry about that. I'm just lazy and have a hard time doing that. But it would be better if you could. So the most important thing overall, like I said before, is that this whole process is about fit, not about objective quality. It's not a measure of you are good enough for this or you are not good enough for this. It's, are you the right fit for the job? And is it the right fit for you? That should be a two-way street. If you specialize in hardcore graphics programming or, photoreal military, simulator sort of art, you're not going to be happy at a 2D pixel art studio. And you're probably not going to get hired for that job because they need somebody who's proven record of what they're doing. So what do you do when you're straight out of school and you do not have much stuff in your portfolio yet? Well, an important thing to realize is that you are more than the sum of your promotional materials. Especially when you don't have a lot to show. You're selling your work ethic, your problem solving, your eagerness to learn, and your enthusiasm as much as you're selling your skills. Most studios would prefer to hire somebody who's proactive and pleasant and hardworking over like a phenom who's a total pain to work with. Especially smaller studios, which is where a lot of the people I went to school with got their start. Apply to anything that you meet most of the requirements for. 80% is a good guideline. If you meet most of the bullet points, don't worry about that one you don't meet. Send your stuff in anyway. The worst they're going to do is completely ignore it. Send a cover letter if you can. Sometimes it's a web form or something and they don't let you do that, but send a short, enthusiastic cover letter if you can, and follow up a week later. That's not rude. Your stuff might have gotten lost in the shuffle. And definitely apply to these jobs yourself. Try not to let anybody else send your resume in on your behalf unless it's like a friend who's internal to that company and can forward it to the right spot. In general, you want to be proactive and enthusiastic, and it's not a great look if your resume gets filtered in from somewhere other than yourself. So, also just keep your chin up. It can be a long process. It took me quite a while to get a job straight out of school because I was looking for something that fit me. I did eventually get there. I do not know anybody whose career path turned out to be exactly what they expected it to be. It can feel pretty overwhelming when you're looking at your portfolio and you're like, I have my student work. I'm up against these people who've been in the industry for a couple of years now. But just keep learning, keep making stuff. Personal projects can be a struggle to fit in, but they're very, very valuable, especially if you're doing something that really shows off the niche you're going for, or shows how you're trying to acquire new skills, or shows something you're very enthusiastic about. A good goal right after you graduate is to try to replace everything in your portfolio as quickly as possible with better stuff, and then do that again. And, you'll get there. Just keep your eye on where you want to end up. That's all I have. I want to try to address some dev stuff in questions if anybody has any. Or more art stuff.
What type of questions would you ask a dev in an interview? Is it more of questions to see if they're just a good fit for the company, or?
The question is what I would ask a dev in an interview. And yes, a lot of it is culture fit. One of the things I always ask, no matter what position it is tell me about a time you missed a deadline, or tell me about your biggest mistake. And what I'm looking for there, for the record, is not, I would never miss a deadline, which I've gotten before in interviews, and like, red flag, do not hire this person, because everybody has missed a deadline. What I'm looking for is how you handle it. Do you talk to your team? Do you reduce scope? Do you take the steps to make it as smooth as possible, knowing you're gonna miss a deadline? Stuff like that. What else do I ask? I tend to try to suss out whether or not somebody is gonna be good in an argument. Are they gonna argue without ego? Are they going to keep the shared goal of everybody in this argument in mind? Or are they just gonna try to win? That is probably pretty specific to my studio. We're very small. We do a lot of stuff just sort of crowdsourced, shouting across the room. It's total chaos. We're almost too big for that to work. But if somebody's going to get really personally invested in the outcome of an argument, regardless of what it is being argued about, that's going to make everybody feel bad. It's going to stifle creativity. We need people who are willing to hear an idea that's better than theirs and be like, oh yes, let's do that. Actually, that's better than what I was arguing for. So I try to get people to talk about team projects, stuff they've done in a group before, times they have had a conflict with people and how it's resolved, stuff like that. It's not, none of those I guess are really dev specific, but for dev specifically, well, I also try to figure out how they work across disciplines. I have worked with some devs who assume that an artist is not as smart as they are, which, regardless of the two individuals involved, is a bad atmosphere to have a collaborative creative discussion in. And I've worked with people all across the board who prefer to be siloed. I'm an introvert myself, like I have to do some quiet thinking on my own to really get to good ideas. But there is a time where you have to go collaborate, and that can be an uncomfortable thing to do across disciplines because, okay, so here's an example. At the company I was at before this, there was a big miscommunication between the artists and the devs. And it turned out that the reason was because the word instance means different things to an artist than it does to a dev. To a dev, it means any instantiation of a prefab at runtime. To an artist, it has a very specific implication that changing one of them will change the other one, because that's how 3D software works. And like, we had almost like a real argument before we realized that this was the problem. And then like, okay, let's just use different words for these things. Like, okay, like that worked out in the end. But it took us a while to get there because we didn't realize that that was even a thing. Does that help at all?
Yeah.
Did somebody else right there have one?
I had almost the same question.
Oh, okay. Anybody else? Art or dev, interview, portfolio, whatever.
Audrey, could you talk more about that, about like what happens when those artists, because the first years are going to do it on Monday, so like when they get together the first time, like that instance is a good example, but are there other communication issues that might happen that they could be aware of?
That's a good question. It's good to keep in mind that everybody in every department has a very different level of technical comfort, I guess is how I would phrase it. It takes a little bit of back and forth to figure out where the other person is on that scale, typically, which can lead to a lot of over-explaining or a lot of under-explaining, and just sort of, you're always making assumptions about what the other person does or doesn't know about where to start talking about a problem. When you get into the weeds with something technical, you've got to establish where your shared knowledge base is in order to even know how to talk about a problem in a way that's useful to everybody. And that isn't really the easiest conversation to have because you never really have it explicitly. The best way to solve it, I think, is to just come at every conversation like that with your shared goal in mind. Like everybody on that team is on the same side and does want what's best for the project overall. So when you're in those moments of frustration where you don't feel like you're being heard or you feel like somebody's talking down to you, just take a breath, remember that everybody wants the same thing, and then with as little ego as you can, clarify. You're like, no, I got that part, this is where I'm stuck. Stuff like that. Like, just communicate openly and civilly, and it usually works itself out.
I'm curious for you, when you get to ask these questions all the time for people who are interviewing. I'm curious for your case, like what was the biggest conflict you personally had with someone in the industry, and how did you resolve that? Words of like wisdom or things to kind of like keep an eye out for when we get into the workplace.
Yeah, the question was what was my biggest conflict with somebody in the industry? So my biggest conflict was when I was at Amazon, which wasn't very well suited for me in the first place because it's a very big company and there's a lot of levels of management, and I tend to I like wearing a lot of hats, I like learning a lot of new stuff, and that a big company was not the place for me. And it wasn't the place for one of my design companions either, and we were on a prototype team, and the demands from above us were not in sync with where we were in the project. We were in the very early, let's try to block out a level and see if the gameplay works stages. And they were like, well, can we get a vertical slice like by this week to show the guy 3 levels above you? And we're like, well, no, like, sorry, like we just cannot do that this week. But you're trying to get as close as you can, and we were just in a place where this guy's manager wanted a level design that mandated like, measurement standards, how tall are the doors, how big is the grid square, and we were not at that place yet. So he was being mandated by his manager to ask for these things from me, and I'm like, we're still trying to pin down art style. We don't have any assets yet. Like we're in the 2D concept art phase here. And it ended up being solved by getting everybody in a room together. And like there was kind of an argument because the 2 managers were not on the team. So they were just, hearing from both ways. Like it was purely a communications issue. And I don't know that we really we got through it. I don't know that we really solved it. But I think we solved it by finding a tool that would get us kind of halfway there for the demo. And then the artist stayed back and kept on the thing we were doing for our own deadlines. So we ended up putting most of it in the level designer's hands to get through that conflict. Like it was, that was just a sort of a too many cooks in the kitchen sort of situation. Does that answer it?
Just curious, yeah.
So, what is working on like a smaller team? What do you think is like? How important do you think it is that programmers know art terms and artists know programmer terms? Like, how well do you think they should know how to interact with each other? Because there's times when a programmer will be like, an artist will just start talking about all this art stuff, and a programmer just like, well, what are you talking about? Or you start bringing up like instancing and all that stuff to an artist, and they're just like, what are you talking about? How important do you think it is to like be able to understand what the other specialty or skill set, like what do you think they should know how the other skill set works?
The question was, how important is it to know the skill set of somebody you're interacting with? And I would say it's, it's not nothing, but the more important component is mutual respect. If you're trusting the other person to know their stuff, there's usually no problem with being like, okay, what, I don't quite follow that. Like, here's where I'm at. Let's meet in the middle. Like, that's usually not a problem. There is a whole lot of cross-departmental collaboration at my company, and it's usually very informal, very casual. I will be like, oh, I need this thing. I've got an error message that can tell this one guy wrote this error message because it's very sarcastic. I'm gonna go bother him. I just walk over to his desk and be like, hey, having a problem with this thing. And like, I know he's gonna tell me how to fix it, or I'll figure it out on my own. Like, it's kind of in the weeds here a little bit, but it's useful to at least listen to the other people. It doesn't tend to be barraging each other with a bunch of very specific technical terms. It's more like, okay, the artist, the designer, and the UI engineer are going to work together on this new menu. Let's talk about division of tasks. Who needs to do what when in order for this to happen in 2 weeks? Okay, you prototype it, keep the dev art, that's fine. I'll come pick some colors for you. We tend to ship a lot of stuff with MVP, minimum viable product, and actually release it into the wild and see how players interact with it before we polish it. We have a very small art team. So a lot of stuff goes out with programmer art, which kind of hurt. Like, that hurt me a little bit at first. I've adapted to it now. But once we know that something is working like we intend, then we'll give it an art pass. And that always involves, okay, I broke the way the UI flow works with my art pass. Hey, Sarah, let's talk about the best way to implement this. And communicating early in that process, like, okay, I've got this stuff to do. What pitfalls should I watch out for from the dev side? Okay, I can do that. Does that answer? I'm sort of scattered answer, but.
So a good buddy of mine is a web designer. He does this stuff, and I was just like, oh yeah, what should I do for a portfolio site? He's like, well, he's like, well, I was supposed to say you're supposed to go out there and that, and then that contradicts what I've been hearing here, which is straightforward, simple. Is there like a blend of standing out and straightforward that is like something for more of this type of field? Is that something that I should try to approach something sort?
Okay, so the question here is, if you've gotten the advice in the past to have a really out there, standout portfolio site, that contradicts what I'm saying about it doesn't have to be standout. Is there a happy medium? And this might be a good time actually to pull up the examples I had pulled up. So I have to log back in here. The answer really is that there isn't a right answer there. If you have a very fancy site and it's still easy to navigate and people can tell what's going on with it, like, it certainly won't hurt you. Like, it can be very cool. People will remember it. It's just not a requirement. By and large, like, a fancy website is not going to fool me if the work is bad. Like, the quality of the work is absolutely more important than the website itself. But as far as fancy websites go, here's my buddy's Mike's. I went to school with this guy a million years ago. We're still very good friends. He's one of the
You might need to go back to that.
all right. He's one of the guys that what's the American one?
That Seattle Center one, I think.
There you go.
Sorry about that. Oh, looks like you're.
Right.
Just read the journal
Go back.
or something.
Wait, no, scroll down to the
It's scroll down
bottom.
to the bottom.
Yeah.
There
Alright.
you go. Yeah.
All right, let's see the first one. Yeah, there we go. So this is one of the guys I always ask to tell me what the worst thing in my portfolio is, and vice versa. It's a few years out of date because he's been at an R&D lab for a while and he's not allowed to show a thing. But he has organized his stuff by project, and it's significantly fancier than my own. He was a UI guy, so you can kind of tell on his website. Embedded videos, which if you're going to put a video, try to embed it. A bunch of visualization stuff. He's done what I mentioned about having a lot of text descriptions about what he did, what he didn't do, why things happen that way. He also, when I asked him if I could use his website here, called out a UI problem with his website, that this is very hard to see. A lot of people have trouble figuring out that you can scroll on this and miss out a bunch of his work. But I really like his site. If I was a web dev, I would probably do something like this. And here is my own. Let's see. It is very simple. This is Squarespace, as I mentioned. I have it organized by project. Talk a little bit about the project overall. There's a shorter text description there, and you can tab through. And that's it. Like, very simple, very straightforward. Personal work at the bottom. Roughly chronological, but not quite. And then this is one of my current coworkers, whose is sort of even simpler, where she just has a bunch of thumbnails. She has done a very good job of including texture sheets and wireframes and different renders and stuff like that, which is very important.
Do people want to see that work in progress?
Which one?
Do people want to see that work in progress, the
I
different
like
pieces
to
of it
see
together?
it, especially the texture sheets for me, because we're looking for hand-painted, like us specifically, we're looking for hand-painted, low-poly models. And a lot of, whenever we give an art test, the first pass almost always comes back where somebody has done a normal bake with a smooth version of the low-poly model, because that's the standard process. But that's not what we do. And it's not what we need to test either, we need the painting. So it's very valuable for me to look at those texture sheets. And it, in general, like, you can get a feel for how good the normal bake is too, and how good the UV unwrapping is, and how good the topology is on a model with a wireframe. And there's a lot of, it's pretty easy to tell looking at somebody's wireframe model, their skill level. So that's a very valuable thing to see. So the answer to your question is basically whatever you feel good about doing for your portfolio. They can all work. All three of these people have jobs. For your own sake, make sure it's easy to update, because you will probably be doing so under duress. If my experience is any indication, it'll probably be like, oh no, I got laid off again. I guess I better update my stuff. Anybody else?
Does Squarespace work with mobile?
The question was, does Squarespace work with mobile? And yes, it does very well.
How big does your team have to be before UI, art, and programming become their own jobs?
Say that again?
How big does a team normally have to be before UI, art, and programming become their own jobs?
So the question is, how big does your team need to be before UI art and UI programming become their own jobs? And bigger than my own. I don't know that I have a number for you. At a mobile studio, which was my last job, we had one of each of those from the start, because the UI, like a mobile game, is almost all UI. When you have somebody on it full time, then you know you need them. I wouldn't say there's a number explicitly. Yeah, I should have asked Mike. He would know, but yeah, it can be a big time sink. It just depends on how much, capital your studio is putting into that kind of thing.
Another question dealing with the two. So how often, or what's expected? Are programmers supposed to bring the art assets into the game engine, or are the artists supposed to bring the art assets into the game engine? Because I feel like that's a big thing that people run into a lot.
The question was, are programmers or artists supposed to implement the assets in the engine? That's a good question. I feel like it should be the artist, but I feel like I'm also in the minority as artists feeling that way. I prefer to implement my own stuff. I prefer to know how to do it. That has raised some eyebrows. People do seem to appreciate it, but I don't know that it's the standard. The smaller the studio, probably the higher the onus is on the artists to implement their own stuff. At a bigger team, my previous job, some of the stuff had to be implemented by a dev because for purposes of streaming in assets, you can't save a prefab in Unity with the sprite in it. You have to strip all of that out before you save it so that it can stream in. There's some crazy process there that made it very hard to work with the assets. So by and large, we would do our art version and then we would pass it on to a dev for final implementation because it involved stuff that you can't see and therefore artists, like, what do you can't animate a thing you can't see. At Against Gravity, I implement everything I can on my own, which is most of what I touch. There'll be some stuff that has to go through a tool that somebody else made, but by and large, I try to do my own. That's something you'll probably have to work out on every team you're on. It'll probably be different in every relationship. Anybody else?
So as far as like having a resume to go along with your portfolio, what type of work should you include? Do you guys want to see all of my work history back to when I was stocking groceries, or are you only interested in like relevant work?
The question was how much work should be on the resume. Is it good to list everything or only what's relevant? And I would say only what's relevant. The exception might be if there's a big gap in your work history. People will ask about that sometimes. When I'm looking at artists, I don't tend to care because it really is mostly the strength of their work. But it's useful on a resume to see what games you shipped, what roles you've had on the team, where you've learned what you've learned. If you had a hand in optimizing, for example, that's very hard to show in a screenshot. You can't really, here's a screenshot of a thing that runs slightly better than it did before I touched it. You know, like that doesn't really show. So that's a good thing to call out in your resume. Let's see. All the different parts of the pipeline you touched, it's probably good to condense that. Like ideally you'll mention it alongside all your pieces to what things you did where, but it's good to be like, okay, on this project, I mostly did, rigging and tech art sort of things. Here's a list of them. We used this software to implement this thing in a weird way. Like that's noteworthy because we kind of had to hack it together, and like I had to learn some stuff here. And like you wanna, one piece of good advice I got about my resume was you don't want to repeat things all the way up. If you learned 3ds Max in your first job, you don't have to mention it again. It's assumed that you still know it. It's better to focus on the new stuff you learned, the new responsibilities you took on at each subsequent place of employment. And if you don't have any prior work history, as many people don't coming out of school, mention your internships, mention your projects, talk about that team you were on in school as though it were a job. Like, the job title obviously is team project, but it still applies in a lot of the same ways. So, good to mention that. Skills at the top when you're a student, that can swap once you have a lot of experience. Does that help?
Yeah.
Cool. Alright, I think maybe we're good.
I have a question
Oh,
for you,
okay.
or maybe you can actually clarify for, I've been asked a few times about internships for students, like what is acceptable, what should they expect, and pay, no pay, what's the general, opinion?
The question is about internships. What should they expect?
Yeah, kind of, yeah.
I don't know a lot about this. I did have an internship straight out of school, and it was paid, but that was rare at the time. And it wasn't in the games industry, which is probably why I got paid at all. It was a little animation studio that did science stuff. In general, though, an internship should be advertised as such. I think interns should be paid if they're doing a lot of work. I don't know if that's typical or not. You should probably, I don't know if there is a set expectation for that. Again, that's going to depend on company, I would expect to learn a lot. I know, art school was the hardest thing I've ever done, and I still learned more in my first 6 weeks at my first job than I did. Like, I couldn't have gotten that job without art school. But still, like, once you start doing it day in, day out, surrounded by people who are doing a lot more of it, you learn so fast. So I would just go into an internship expecting that you don't know much about what's going on, and that you will be learning it. Okay, guys, well, thanks for having me.
Awesome.